Chapter 3, we're going to talk about early biological perspectives of crime. Okay, don't know why our slides are doing that. That's a little scary. So, criminology has been slow to give any credence or validity to biological theories. Mostly this is because of its strong roots in the social sciences. Also, early biological theories were pretty simplistic in their approach, and most of those have since been proven false. Newer theories, though, which we'll talk about in Chapter 4, hold that genes and related biological features are more likely to be facilitators rather than determinants of behavior. Now, some principles of biological theories focus on the brain as the center of personality and the major determinant in controlling human behavior. And it's focusing then on those internal sources, so our genetics and our physical makeup, how they influence our mental processes. Now, these early theorists focus mainly on physical features and heredity. They looked at things like facial features, body type, and shape of the skull. Some argued that criminality ran in families and could be inherited. Now, contemporary theorists look at the interaction between things like genes, chromosomes, diet, hormones, environmental contaminants, neurophysical conditions, and the environment, and how that impacts our behavior. Now, this slide is really difficult to read, so please refer to it in your chapter. But it's telling us the fundamental assumptions of biological theories. First is that the brain is the organ of the mind, and that's where our personality is located. The basic determinants of human behavior are to a considerable degree genetically based, and that would include criminal tendencies. Observed gender and racial differences and rates and types of criminality could be partially due to biological differences between the sexes and between racially distinct groups. The basic determinants of human behavior may be passed down from one generation to another. Much of human conduct is fundamentally rooted in instinctive behavioral responses, characteristics of biological organisms everywhere. So this includes things like territoriality, condemnation of adultery, and acquisitiveness are 3 examples. Now, the biological roots of human conduct have become increasingly disguised because modern forms of indirect expressive behavior have replaced more primitive and direct ones. At least some human behavior is the result of biological tendencies inherited from more primitive development stages in the evolutionary process, and the interplay among hereditary, biology, and social environment is probably a better explanation. And that last one is really focusing on what we'll talk about in Chapter 4. Now, the positivist school of thought says all valid knowledge is acquired through observation. And it's got 2 main principles. The first is that human behavior is determined not by the exercise of free will, but by factors beyond the control of us as individuals. And the second piece of this is using scientific techniques to study crime and criminology. Now, the term positivism is coined in the rootings of Comte, who is considered the father of sociology, and he believed that social phenomena could be observed, explained, and measured in objective and qualitative terms. Now, one of the first schools of thought we see here is phrenology. This is the idea that the shape of our skull would be able to reveal defects in our brain, and that depending on where that shape changes, that would be indicative of problems with that particular area of the brain. So the shape of the skull is related to personality, and we could use this to distinguish criminals from non-criminals. Now, the themes here is that the brain is the organ of the mind, and as I mentioned, particular aspects of our personality are associated with specific locations in our brain. Personality characteristics associated with well-developed portions of the brain are going to be more prominent. And then the shape of the skull corresponds to the shape of the brain, therefore revealing to us personality traits. Now, Spurzheim was a student of Gall and brought phrenology to the United States, and then it was used to classify and evaluate newly admitted prisoners. Now, the Italian school of thought is founded by Cesare Lombroso. He coins the term atavism. Atavistic, and he talks about born criminals as atavistic throwbacks. This is the idea that it's based on Darwin's theory of evolution, that criminals are somehow less evolved. And so criminality is the result of primitive urges that survived the evolutionary process. And Lombroso talks about atavistic stigmata. These are things that, qualities or traits that indicate that we are more or less evolved. If you had at least 5 atavistic stigmata, you were considered to be a born criminal. This included things like the span between your arms, if you were to hold your arms out directly to both sides. Generally, the distance between each middle fingertip is the same as your height. Now, if that was longer than that, so you had particularly long arms, that was an atavistic trait. If you had a beak-like nose, large lips, supernumerary nipples, these are all atavistic traits. Now, he studied this and came to these conclusions by conducting postmortem studies of the bodies of executed offenders and deceased offenders. Now, this leads to the school of criminal anthropology, which is the scientific study of relationships between human physical characteristics and criminality. It's also known as the Italian school and also includes theorists like Ferri and Garofalo. Now, Lombroso is considered the father of modern criminology because he's the first to employ that scientific method. He's measuring, observing, and making generalizations. Atavism implies that criminals are born that way. And so his categories of offenders include born criminals, which is about 70% of offenders, those who are insane, criminaloids, who are occasional criminals, and then criminals incited by passion. Now, Charles Buckman Goering conducted a well-controlled statistical study of Lombroso's thesis and found that the whole idea of this is unsound. So we know, even though Lombroso is the first to really study something scientifically, we know that this doesn't hold true. This is not a way that we can distinguish criminal offenders from non-offenders. Now, the next set of theories looks at the body types, genetics, and other types of observable physical characteristics. And the first one we have here is the school using somatotypes. This is looking at classifying offenders according to body types. And Sheldon basically linked body types to personalities, and he concluded that mesomorphs were the most likely to be criminal offenders. Now, let's take a quick look at his 4 body types. This is often, by the way, presented as 3 body types. Usually the balanced type is not included in this. So an endomorph is someone more like Santa Claus. They're soft and round. They're overweight and have a large stomach. Now, an ectomorph is a little bit like olive oil, thin and fragile, long, slender, poorly muscled extremities. A mesomorph is athletic and muscular. Now, when you look at these 3, and then we have the balanced type, but when we look at these 3 and we see this mesomorph, it sort of makes sense that he might be more likely to be an offender, right? He's muscular, and so he would be more successful at committing aggressive acts. Now, other researchers looked at criminal families and decided that perhaps heredity played a role here. And this contributes to the field of behavioral genetics. And this is the study of genetic and environmental contributions to variations in human behavior. In the late 1880s, researchers began focusing on these criminal families that appear to exhibit criminal tendencies across decades. One family that's studied is the Juke family, and they're described as very criminogenic in nature. Now, Goddard studied the Kallikak family, and he studied 2 branches of this family. This man reproduced with a barmaid, which was an illegitimate branch of his family because he never married her. And then later he married a, quote, righteous Quaker girl. And so we're able to compare these 2 branches of the family. Now, in the legitimate branch, there's only a few minor deviants. But in the illegitimate branch, there are 262 feeble-minded births and epileptics, alcoholics, and criminal descendants. Now, you might take this to believe that crime is what's being inherited, but Goddard determined that what was actually inherited was feeble-mindedness. Now, this early research failed to consider the role of social and physical environments and led to the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement is the idea of selective human breeding to improve the species. It's generally the idea that we are going to force sterilization upon undesirables. Now, eugenic criminology says the root causes of crime are passed down in the form of bad genes, and that genes are a major determining factor in behavior. Now, in Buck v. Bell in 1927, the Supreme Court did support a Virginia statute permitting sterilization, and they said, quote, "It is better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society prevent those persons who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." Now, eugenics continues into the United Kingdom into the 1960s, but it's largely discredited in the US because of the Nazi use of genetic research, mass sterilization, and eugenic programs. Now, another thing that gets discovered while Patricia Jacobs is looking at Scottish prisoners, she finds a small number of male prisoners have what's called an XYY syndrome. Okay? They have an extra Y chromosome. So normally men get an X chromosome from their mother and then a Y chromosome from their father. Women get an X from both their mother and their father. These are referred to as super males and considered potentially violent. And this led to attempts to use this as a defense in court. But there's little evidence to suggest that they commit crimes of greater violence, although they may commit more crimes overall. Now, one of the ways we can try to study genetics and whether or not genetics plays a role in criminal behavior is to look at twins. Okay, so dizygotic twins are fraternal twins. Two eggs get fertilized at the same time. Monozygotic twins are identical. One egg is fertilized and it splits early on. So they have the exact same DNA. Now, if behavior is substantially heritable, twins should display similar characteristics despite any variation in their social environment. And we should see this most strongly then in identical twins. Twin studies do show that behavior does seem to have a strong heritable component. Now, a Danish study of twins found that 52% of identical twins and 22% of fraternal twins displayed the same degree of criminality. And this was apparent even amongst twins separated at birth. Now, these genetic influence appeared strongest in the commission of petty nonviolent offenses. But basically, they're arguing here that the genetic risk for criminal behavior is enhanced by the environment. Now, a Minnesota twin family study looked at more than 8,000 pairs of twins, and they found that monozygotic twins, identical twins, reared apart, are about as similar as those reared together in terms of personality, temperament, occupational and leisure time interests, and social attitudes. A British study also found that common bad behavior is substantially heritable. And a 2003 study found that antisocial children can be identified early on, as young as 3 years old. Behavior is nearly impossible to control and change by the time they reach kindergarten. And heredity plays a larger role in this problematic behavior than home life or parenting does. Now, what are the biological roots of aggression? Now, Conrad Lorenz is describing how aggression permeates the animal kingdom. And he's a believer in Darwin's evolutionary thesis that interspecies aggression favors the strongest and best animals in terms of reproduction. And he concluded that aggression serves a variety of purposes. It ensures an even distribution of animals over a habitable area and provides for defense of the species against predators. Now, aggression serves very similar purposes for humans. But for humans, it can also take on covert forms. That desire to acquire wealth and power is often part of human mating rituals. This might allow a man to win a, quote, prized woman through displays of more civilized forms of what could otherwise be understood as interspecies aggression. Now, Lawrence says that all human behavior is adaptive instinctive behavior. Basically, much of our behavior is fundamentally rooted in our instinct, our instinctive behavioral responses. And those are characteristics of biological organisms everywhere. Now, much of what we call crime, according to Lawrence, is the result of overcrowded living conditions combined with the lack of legitimate opportunity for effective expression of aggression. Basically, crowding increases the likelihood of aggression. Crime may also be found to be the result of stresses that have been found to typically produce aggression throughout the animal kingdom. Now, Edward Wilson coins the term sociobiology, which is the systematic study of the biological basis of all social behavior. And he says that most social behavior is shaped by natural selection. And he focuses on a couple of things. One argument he makes is that altruism is actually inherited. Altruism facilitates the continuity of the gene pool among altruistic individuals. He also says that territoriality explains many forms of conflict, homicide, warfare, and aggression, because intergroup responses are still crude and primitive. And he also says that this plays a role in tribalism. That's our strong feelings of identification with our own social group. And this has led to the proliferation of street gangs, racial tension, and separatist groups. Now, what are some critiques of these early theories? Well, they ignore the role of free will. They basically say that you don't have any choice in what you do. There's also problems because how do we take these biological variables when crime itself is a social construct, right? Crime doesn't have something biologically unique to it. Crime is defined by society. It's also difficult to link specific biological features with potential crime, and it's unlikely that there's any one feature that could explain all crime. Now, finally, a more sensible approach might be to work to identify biological influences on characteristics most criminals share. So what separates law violators and law enforcers may be in nature of social environment to which we are exposed when growing up. And it may be impossible to identify any features shared solely by criminals.